All right, we are continuing on in Chapter 1, and we are continuing our discussion of Darwin's theory of evolution. There's a couple of Ernsts in here, but this is a drawing by Ernst Haeckel, and this is sort of his conception of how evolution works. So here is another scientist named Ernst Mayr who says that we should split evolution into 5 theories. It's not actually just this one thing. It is these 5 separate and generally well-supported ideas. Some of them are a bit more controversial than others or not as well proved, and we're going to go through each one and discuss it. So the 5 different theories of evolution are perpetual change, common descent, multiplication of species, gradualism, and natural selection. So perpetual change is the first one. It is not controversial at all, and it is evidenced very easily by the fossil record. You can go back and you can find the stone remains of ancient life, and you can see that we have changed throughout time. This represents a phylogeny, but you can see the bones of our ancestors, and you can see that clearly species are changing throughout time. Again, there's no real controversy here. If you care to look, the evidence for this is readily available. We also have common descent. Common descent is evidenced by comparative biology, physiology, DNA, cell structure, macromolecular structures, etc. And you can actually look at the genetics of organisms and see that we are indeed related to one another. You can track the change in our DNA throughout time, and it points back to common ancestry. So all of these, anatomy, physiology, cell structure, DNA, all of these things point back to commonality of life, that we all came from a common ancestor. Next up, we have the multiplication of species. This is Darwin's third theory of evolution. And you can observe this one empirically like Darwin did. You can see we have 4 species of finch that are very closely related but look quite different because they were separated into their island habitats. Another cool example of this is the evolution of cichlid fish. I believe these are Tanzanian fish, but there are cichlid fish everywhere. And in Lake Tanzania in particular, you can see them evolving very, very, very rapidly. There are many, many different species of these fish that are all pretty closely related to one another, all within one lake, which is very cool. So the multiplication of species you can actually see happening. Here is some multiplication of species that actually I studied, and our research showed that within the genus Speyeria, there are in fact at least 16 diagnosable species and maybe several other subspecies. So we can actually watch and see species evolving. You can use evidence to look at this, or you can go back to Darwinian ideas and just look at their beaks. By the way, if you look at the DNA of these finches, you can see that they are all indeed very closely related to one another as well. So now we start getting into ideas that are a little bit more controversial. The idea of gradualism, which is that species slowly change over time. You can see the idea of gradualism in vestigial structures like the vestigial wings of this ostrich. It doesn't use them for flying anymore. And in its ancestors, you can see that these were indeed flight wings. You can see this in transitional fossils, that species are very, very slowly changing over time. And you can see the gradual change in species via genetics. Now, the reason that this is somewhat controversial is because sometimes species, in fact, do change very, very quickly, like the peppered moth that we're going to talk about in just a moment. Like, in fact, my genus Speyeria, it's not my genus, but this genus of Speyeria, these things evolved very, very quickly once they arrived in North America. We're talking about tens of thousands of years, which feels like a long time, but is in fact very, very, very quick. So anyway, Darwin's fourth theory, and the more controversial one, is gradualism. The idea that species are large differences in anatomical traits among species originate by accumulation of many small incremental changes over very long periods of time. We also have the notion of natural selection, and you can just see this one. You can see this in the peppered moths that we looked at the experiment about. You can see this in the ptarmigan. There's a quote from W.L.N. Tickle, who, while reviewing proposed explanations of white plumage in birds, writes that in the ptarmigan, it is difficult to escape the conclusion that cryptic brown summer plumage becomes a liability in snow, and white plumage is therefore another cryptic adaptation. And so these birds change. They are selected, or I should say these birds change based on what they are selected for based on where they live. If they live in snow, it's going to select for white plumage. If they live on rocks, it's going to select for this dark, like tortoiseshell colored plumage. Okay. Natural selection explains that organisms are constructed to meet the demands of their environment through adaptation. We also have the notion of antibiotic resistance, which increases a bacterial population's resistance to antibiotics. We'll probably look at that in more fine detail in lab or later on in the semester. But we've got to look at several different observations and inferences made in support of natural selection. Many of these ideas came from Malthus, this fellow here, who you should remember from previous lectures. He was the guy that talked about limits to population growth. Okay, so observation 1, organisms have great potential fertility, which permits exponential growth of populations. Observation 2, natural populations normally do not increase exponentially, but remain fairly constant in size. So organisms have the ability to grow exponentially, but usually stay around some carrying capacity. Observation 3, natural resources are limited. Okay. So these three observations lead us to inference 1, which is that a struggle for existence occurs among organisms in a population. So again, organisms could potentially grow exponentially. They do when they have unlimited resources. You see this all the time in things as advanced as mammals. The fact that they do not increase exponentially because resources are limited leads us to a struggle for existence within a population. Observation 4 is that variation occurs among organisms within populations, so not all organisms are born the same. They are born differently based on heritable characteristics, which leads us to inference 2. Varying organisms show differential survival and reproduction favoring advantageous traits or natural selection, which leads us to inference 3. Natural selection, acting over many generations, gradually produces new adaptations and new species. So the idea here is that organisms' populations could grow exponentially, but because their resources are limited, they wind up competing over resources. Because they're competing over resources, and because not all of these individuals are the same, because they've inherited different characteristics that might make them more or less successful, different organisms are going to survive, and whichever organisms have the more advantageous traits will be selected for. So these are the observations and inferences that lead us to believe or accept the evidence for natural selection.